Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that, but it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolong Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolong is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, from Camelot on the river to a crime scene, a woman is found murdered in her family's beloved summer home. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Alice.
Don't even know what language. I thought you were going to go with something Olympic or French.
Nope.
You didn't go that route?
Nope. So
only because we're in the middle of the Olympics right now, which we haven't talked about at all.
Yeah. That is Maori for family.
Oh.
Yeah, there you go.
Maori, that's awesome.
That's you. You're family.
I am family.
You are. Might as well be blood. A blood relative.
I thought you were going to say homely.
Sister by another mother. That doesn't really work.
That doesn't work.
Sister by another mister. I think. How about that?
That's the right one.
There you go.
That's the right one.
There you go.
All right.
That rhymed. Okay.
It's good to be back. You guys, this small talk isn't working because both of us are so hot. It's approximately 100 degrees with the AC on. I hope you guys are doing great in the dog days of summer. But you know what? October's coming up soon, so you have that to look forward to.
By the time you hear this, it'll be September. So hopefully we'll be cooler where you are and cooler where we are. But we'll see. We'll see.
But until then, you get to hear our kind of like overheated exhaustion rants.
Yeah. And, we're talking about summer. It's summer while we record this. This murder that we're going to talk about today, which is a real mystery, happened at a summer home. And the case we're going to talk about is relatively new. It is unsolved. It absolutely can be solved. It is one of those where someone knows something and the police are one piece of evidence away. So this is a case we really wanted to do. We really wanted to highlight because it's one where you never know. Somebody out there might be able to make a difference. And it's the case of Margaret Peggy Thornton Lammers. And we're excited to talk about her case today. If you enjoy this case or you find it to be fascinating, the Murder Sheet did an episode on this a couple years ago that's really good and really informative. They have an interview with the local police and the FBI agent who are looking into this case. So it's a good sort of on the ground listening to what the investigators can say to the extent they can talk about this case. Now, what's interesting is they have given us some pretty critical information that really narrows down what happened here. So we're going to go through the story, we're going to talk about the evidence, and then we're going to talk about what it means. Try to sort of see through the fog for you to what kind of person we should be looking at that is involved in this case. With that, go ahead and start. So we're talking about Margaret Peggy Thornton Lammers. She was born January 24th, 1956, to her parents, John and Marjorie Thornton. She had two siblings, Anne and Jack, who she was very close with. And one of the things that's going to define her throughout the story is how close she is to her family. This is a tight-knit group, and they enjoyed the sort of idyllic family life, and it was made even better when John and Marjorie built a beautiful vacation home in Deltaville, Virginia in the early 1970s. The home, which the family affectionately referred to as the River House, was a waterfront cottage with panoramic views of the Piankatonk River. I got pretty close on that one, actually, which flows into Chesapeake Bay. So if you know this area, beautiful. I mean, this is an absolutely beautiful area. Wonderful place to live. Wonderful place to vacation. To quote every Dateline episode, the kind of place where nothing bad ever happens, where you don't have violence and you don't have murders. The family spent most of their weekends and summers at the home. They could swim, they could sail, they could go fishing, and it was their heaven on earth, or as Anne described it, our Camelot. And this was a place that Peggy loved, and she loved it even as she grew older, which is only going to make the tragedy of what happened there even more stark.
Yeah, this area truly is beautiful. If you look it up on a map, it's not really close to anything because it's right on the coast, but you can get there from Washington, D.C., you can get there from Richmond, and it is truly just beautiful nature, which is what is going to be the backdrop of this horrific murder we're about to talk about. Now, in 1987, Peggy married Tony Lammers and moved to Cleveland, Ohio, and there they had 3 children, Jay, Ann Jordan, or AJ, and Presley. Peggy took to motherhood completely, and she was described by her son Jay as caring deeply for others and constantly putting their needs above her own, especially her family and her children. Peggy shared her love of the River House, though, with her children, even though they lived in Cleveland, Ohio. They would make sure to spend countless summers at the River House making family memories. In 2015, Peggy's mother, who she was very close to, Marjorie, passed away. And a year later, sadly, in 2016, Peggy's father, John's health also began to decline. And Peggy, being close to her family, decided to move back home to Richmond to care for her ailing father until his death in November 2016. Her husband and now adult children remained in Cleveland, but the family still saw each other very often because Peggy would return home from time to time, and the rest of the Lammers family would come to visit whenever they could in Virginia. Peggy was still living in Richmond in July 2017 while she worked on settling her parents' estate. Those of you who've gone through this process before, it can be, even if your parents have done all the right things, done the wills and the trusts and whatnot, dealing with estates can still take a lot of time, can take upwards of years, especially if you have more than one property. And so that's why she kind of stayed in Virginia even after both her parents had passed to deal with all of these estates and properties. And it was then that the family's beloved River House would become a site of deep tragedy when Peggy Thornton Lammers was found brutally murdered in that home.
I got to say, I've been to Cleveland. I like Cleveland. Great little town. I'd much rather be in the River House, I think, in Virginia, especially during like the winter. We were just talking about weather and how hot it is. I don't know if you've been to Cleveland in January, but it's a little rough. So let's do the timeline. We'll start in 2015. As Alice said, it was then that Peggy's mother, Marjorie, passed away. February 2016, Peggy relocates from Cleveland to Richmond to care for her sick father. You might be thinking to yourself, why couldn't one of her other siblings take care of her dad? Well, her kids were adults. They stayed in Cleveland. Her husband stayed in Cleveland. Her sister, Anne, she was living in Richmond at the time, but she had young children. So it was more of a burden for her. She really needed help as well. And since they were able to travel pretty easily, see each other pretty easily, it just made sense for Peggy to go ahead and move down there, take care of her father, and become his primary caregiver. And this continued for about 9 months. Peggy's father would pass away in November of 2016. And at this point, she actually moved in with her sister Anne, off and on, in Richmond, while she worked through settling her parents' estate, as Alice was saying.
So at the end of June 2017, Peggy is met at the River House by her husband, Tony, her sister, Anne, and her daughter, AJ. And the family was there in order to celebrate the 4th of July weekend together, which is always a fun thing to do at a vacation home. On July 4th, 2017, after a nice long weekend all together, Tony and AJ left to head back to Ohio because they both had work. Peggy, however, stayed behind because she was still working on the estate. The next day, on July 5th, 2017, Peggy and her sister headed back to Anne's home in Richmond. Then on July 8th, 2017, Peggy left Anne's home and returned back to the River House. She let her family know that she intended to stay there a little while longer.
And the thing about this, she would visit the River House often, but at least according to the police, it wasn't entirely common for her to stay at the River House by herself. But, we're in this wonderful, beautiful summer season, and I think she just decided, since I'm here and I have this place I love, I'm going to stay there, spend some time there, enjoy this property. And who knows, she's working through settling her family's estate. The intention might have been to sell it. It might have been easier to sell it, divided amongst the various siblings. We don't really know that, but you can imagine all sorts of things that are shaking out here. She's been there in the area for a while. I'm sure she anticipated she would be moving back to Cleveland pretty soon for the majority of her time. So how often is she going to be able to get out there? She's going to spend a few more days there. And she does. She goes back on July 8th. On July 10th, she speaks with several of her family members throughout the day. And her plan originally was to return to Richmond that day. And this is important. So she intended to leave, but she decided to stay one more night at the River House. And that would end up being a faithful decision. So at 5:14 p.m., Peggy makes her last phone call. At 7:13, she sends her last text message. I believe it is to her sister, though I've never seen that confirmed. So this day rolls over into the next, July 11th, 2017. At 1:11 a.m., the last data usage on Peggy's phone is recorded. Now, data usage, as I think most of you know, it essentially refers to anything that you're doing that isn't calling or texting. So Peggy was known to scroll through Facebook. She's not unlike most of us. I mean, what do you do in the middle of the night when you can't go to sleep? You're scrolling through Instagram, scrolling through Facebook. She was also known to play a lot of games on her phone, so investigators speculate that she's probably doing something like that. She's either looking at social media or she's playing some games. They don't know specifically what she was doing, and they can't tell us specifically what she was doing for some reasons that we're going to talk about in a second. So that happens at 1:11 a.m. The phone goes silent. Throughout the rest of the day, as the night turns into morning, several of Peggy's family members attempt to get in contact with her. Her sister Anne calls her twice and gets no response. And she noted that Peggy's phone was going straight to voicemail, which was unusual for her, and so she becomes concerned. AJ, who is Peggy's oldest daughter, tries calling her mother after work, and this was their typical nightly routine. They spoke pretty much every day. AJ would get off work, she'd call her mom. But Peggy didn't answer, which was definitely unusual and concerning. Now, Tony had also tried contacting his wife several times throughout the day, and it was unsuccessful.
So at 5:30 that day, it's been several hours now since anyone's heard from her, and you can tell that they're a close-knit family, extended family, immediate family. They usually talk a lot. So as time passed, everyone's concerns continued to grow, and Tony called Anne around 5:30 that night to see if she had spoken to Peggy that day. And when Tony learned that Anne had also been unable to contact Peggy, Tony called the Middlesex County Sheriff's Office and asked that they perform a welfare check at the River House. Note how quickly everything is in motion. There's a welfare check really within 24 hours of her last speaking to folks. At 6 p.m., the deputy from the sheriff's office arrived at the Stove Point Road residence, and he immediately noticed that the front door had a footprint on it, and the screen had been slightly torn. Now, the deputy knocks on the door, but no one answers. But he looks kind of across the way because there's several homes on this on the waterfront. And he notices a party that's taking place at a neighbor's house. And so he walks over and he decides to see if maybe Peggy's there. Maybe that's why she's not answering the door. Or at the very least, see if anyone at this party may have information about where Peggy is. But when he gets there and he asks if people have seen Peggy and if she's there, they confirm that she is not there. And no one at the party had any knowledge of where she may be. So at this point, the deputy returns back to the river house. This time, one of the neighbors actually accompanies him over to the house.
So at this point, the officer's very concerned. He's got the neighbor with him. They're going to go back to the house. They don't go through the front door, but instead they go to the back, and they see that the sliding back door is open. It's open about 1.5 to 2 feet. So the deputy goes inside while the neighbor remains on the deck. Upon entry, he immediately notices there is a large telescope knocked over on the ground. He moves further into the home and he makes a gruesome discovery. Peggy's brutalized body lay in the hallway outside of the bedroom. She has been bludgeoned to death. She was 61 years old at the time of her murder. An autopsy would later be performed, obviously, and reveals something interesting. She wasn't actually bludgeoned to death. She did receive extreme blunt force trauma, but her skull wasn't fractured, and she had actually bled to death. This is reminiscent, those of you who remember the staircase, where you had an instance where someone was in a pool of blood at the bottom of stairs, severely injured, massive lacerations on the back of her head, and yet she had no skull fractures whatsoever. In fact, she had bled to death. Same thing here. You have someone who, when the police first find her, they think, wow, this is a beating. But then they find that she has no skull fractures, but she has bled to death. Now, this case is different in that there's some pretty significant defensive wounds. For instance, Peggy's thumb had been dislocated. Investigators actually theorized that Peggy had been kicked to death. Now, this hasn't been proven, but you can imagine why they thought this. If, for instance, she had been beaten with an object, a baseball bat, a tree branch, any number of things, if you'd slammed her head into the ground with some viciousness, you would expect those skull fractures that we talk about sometimes, but you don't have that. And so the police speculated that this was someone who was kicking her hard enough to cause massive bleeding, but not hard enough to actually fracture her skull, which is an incredibly brutal, personal, violent murder. And those facts are going to be important as we move forward and start to think about who did this. Now, Peggy was barefoot, but there were bloody shoe prints around her body. And given that she was barefoot, pretty good idea that those shoe prints belong to whoever did this. Now, a quick glance at the crime scene made it seem obvious initially that Peggy was the victim of a break-in. There was that footprint on the front door, which indicated that someone had kicked the door in. The sliding back door was left partially open, with a large telescope knocked over on the ground, which was near the sliding door. So someone kicks it in. They find Peggy in the hallway. They're going to rob the place. They didn't expect somebody to be there, but there she is. They beat her to death, and then they flee out the back door. Farther into the home, the contents of the medicine cabinet had been dumped into the sink, which is not that uncommon when you have someone who robs a place, particularly these summer homes, because you're looking for certain things. Yes, the people who tend to do things like that are looking for valuables, but they're also looking for drugs. They're looking for things like Oxy or really any kind of prescription drugs that you can use to get high on. So they've done that. They've also dumped 2 dresser drawers, emptied onto the bed. And eerily, there was a bloody knife that was left perfectly center of the kitchen sink, which, given that it had blood on it, may, at least initially, police thought might have had something to do with Peggy's death.
This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, Set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/Wondery.
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
But as Brett noted, things really aren't as they seemed. Although initially it appeared that Peggy was killed in a break-in, detectives weren't so sure. There were several glaring issues in this crime scene, leading investigators to believe that this was likely staged by the killer to look like a break-in. To start, there were no signs of forced entry. Though the sliding back door was open, this door only locked from the inside. And that telescope that we talked about that looked like it had been bumped over or had fallen over, which you can imagine if you had a burglar come in, they're rushing to get out, they maybe knock it over. It doesn't appear that it had fallen over there, because if it had done so, it would have marked the wood floor beneath it, because it weighed about 25 to 30 pounds. In fact, there was nothing scuffed on the ground to indicate such a fall. And the police concluded that the telescope must have been placed on the ground to make it look like the place had been ransacked. And the other thing that was really strange that made police begin to think this was staged and not actually a home burglary was that nothing of value was actually taken. Jewelry and cash were left behind, and only things that were missing from the home was a small 19-inch TV and Peggy's cell phone. If you know anything about TVs, it is a smart TV, but 19 inches is pretty small. We're not talking about like a 60, 70, 80-inch TV. Relatively small, and I think it was close to the door as well, so it was like an easy thing to grab if you're trying to make it look like a burglary. But the interesting thing, of course, is that Peggy's cell phone, which we've always said is like your personal tracking device, is gone. Now, finally, remember that knife in the sink? It was confirmed to have Peggy's blood on it, but here's where it gets really weird. Peggy did not suffer any knife wounds, leading investigators to conclude that this knife was actually placed in the sink with Peggy's blood on it intentionally to mislead investigators or something like that, but it wasn't the murder weapon. Now, further, investigators believe that the River House would have been a strange target for a random break-in. We've talked a little bit about this area. It's a safe, kind of remote area. The cottage was at the end of a single-lane gravel road, and because of the trees, it actually wasn't clearly visible from the street, so you may not even know a home is back there unless you know of this River House. And if a random intruder's motive was, in fact, murder, it would have been a strange place to target because this was an area that was predominantly summer homes. So you are hitting it sometime after the July 4th weekend when a lot of people leave their vacation homes. That person who broke in wanting to murder someone would be doing so not knowing if anyone was actually in there to be his victim. So what if the motive was robbery? Then why wasn't anything taken from the home? This is why police begin to start scratching their head and think they're dealing with something very different than what it initially seemed.
So this crime happened all the way back in 2017. And you might think, look, you got a case where somebody's murdered. It's in a fairly well-to-do neighborhood, the kind of place you don't have a lot of violence. It's a violent attack, the kind of attack that you might think would leave a lot of evidence, DNA, fingerprints, hair, all sorts of other things. And so you might expect that this would be very quickly solved. But in fact, it hasn't been quickly solved. And we're now 7 years later, and police are still trying to find who killed Peggy. And it's not just local police. The FBI has also been involved. And we've talked about this before. Why is the FBI involved? When the FBI becomes involved, people's minds race. I mean, is this somehow a federal crime? Is there some sort of deep, dark conspiracy here? Well, a lot of times, the locals will simply ask the FBI if they're willing to assist, particularly when you have a situation where I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this police department is probably not that familiar with the kind of complex investigation you're going to have, such as the one here. So the FBI has been helpful. They released a video, 2 or 3 minute video, a couple years ago that actually included a lot of video of the scene. So if you're imagining what we're talking about with the telescope knocked over and the drugs in the sink and everything else, if you watch that video, which we'll link to, you'll see all that. Now, obviously, you're not going to see Peggy's body. They don't show you that. But you'll see all these different things, all these different factors, all this different evidence. And the reason that the police have been fairly open, including, as we've just discussed, about their suspicion that this was not a random attack and this wasn't actually a robbery, is because they desperately want the public's help. They believe the only way we're going to solve this case is if we do have the public's help. So we're going to talk about sort of the theories. I mean, there's really only 2 for a second. And then we're going to sort of back up and talk about this evidence some more and talk about exactly what it tells us about what potentially happened to Peggy.
And to kind of add to that, Brett, I think setting the scene is helpful here. This is very much a vacation area, right? I think when police are interviewed about this, they say that the population of this area triples in the summer. So it really is a sleepy town. People don't go here unless they're coming here to vacation. This isn't just like the middle of an urban area downtown. It's, quite a drive from Richmond. It is not an urban area that you would just kind of float around to go shopping. You are there for a purpose. And you see kind of how close-knit the area is. When the police come over, a neighbor actually comes over with the police, I want to see what's going on. Is she okay? I'm worried about her too, if you guys aren't hearing from her. And the fact that they're able to zero in so quickly, the family members, that not hearing from Peggy is a strange thing within this day shows you that there's not much to do at the River House. The River House is just that. Like, you hang out at the house. There's not places to go party or to go eat. You're at the house or you're kind of back in Richmond. And so if she's not talking to anyone, that is strange.
And I can imagine Peggy probably spent a lot of her time sitting on the front porch, looking out over the water, drinking coffee and talking on the phone to her friends. That was what she did most of the day. And not a bad way to live your life. And she was obviously very connected. I mean, I wish I talked to my parents as much as she did. And she's talking to her daughter every single day. So, yeah, I think this was immediately concerning. And it is a testament to how tight-knit this community was and how tight-knit her family is, which is why the theory of the police is one that's pretty disturbing. So let's talk about theories.
So the first theory is one that is kind of the most obvious one. When you walk in and see a shoe print on the door, the back door, sliding door open, seems like things have been taken. It's ransacked a little bit. Obviously, this could have been a break-in gone wrong. But while there were break-ins in the area, at times, murder was incredibly rare. And this particular neighborhood had one way in and one way out. And remember, this house was not really visible from the street at all. So if someone went in, they went in to burglarize this house. And yet, despite kind of the high risk of burglarizing a home that's just a vacation home. And I say that because, of course, vacation homes, if you have enough money to have a vacation home, of course, you may think there may be things of value in there, but you're probably not going to have all your jewelry there. You're probably not going to have lots of things of value that you just regularly store there. You'll just have your vacation things. Doesn't mean there's nothing of value, but you would be risking a lot to go to this one-way street, to this home that may or may not have many things of value, and then all you take is a 19-inch flat screen TV and someone's cell phone, which if you know anything about committing crimes, you definitely don't want to turn on. You don't want to sell. You don't want it to be traced back to you in any way. So the phone, I see more of as destroying evidence rather than taking it as part of a burglary for purposes of making money on it. So then you really only have the 19-inch flat screen TV, which I don't know, maybe could go for $20-30 on the Facebook marketplace, not something high. When you have clearly visible jewelry, wallets, the telescope, I mean, that's a heavy telescope, but you have other things that are clearly valuable and can get you some quick cash if that's what you're looking for in front of you. But none of that is missing.
You might be thinking to yourself, well, yeah, but maybe, the burglar, they break in and they come upon Peggy and they beat her to death, and then they freak out and they flee. And so that's why they didn't steal anything. And if Peggy hadn't been there, they would have stole a whole bunch of stuff. But the problem with that theory is if this is a staged scene, the person who staged it just a little too much. Because if that had happened, then what would you not see? Maybe you would see them grabbing the television and running out the back door. But you wouldn't see the clothes dumped on the bed. You wouldn't see the pills dumped in the sink. Those are things that are meant to telegraph to whoever who walks in, this is a robbery. Look at how they ransacked the place. But if they had ransacked the place, that would have happened after they beat Peggy. So they did not flee in terror immediately after doing that. Instead, they spent some time in the house doing those things. And yet, despite doing those things, they didn't actually take stuff like the jewelry and the money. So the jewelry and the money being there is important. It's not just they freaked out and left. It seems pretty clear that this entire thing was a setup to make you think it was a robbery, but they did too much. They did too much stuff, and they didn't take enough stuff to make it convincing. And what Alice said about the cell phone, hold that in your mind, because we're going to talk about that more in a second. I'll say one other thing about this. I don't own a vacation home, but if you do, there is a burglary season. And it tends to be wherever the place is, the off season. So if you have a ski chalet, it's going to get robbed in the summer. If you have a summer house, it's going to be robbed in the winter. This area had a problem with burglaries, but it had a burglary season. Those things happened in the off season when most people weren't there. There would be break-ins, people would steal whatever valuables were there, and they'd get away, right? So it's not that you would never see one, but seeing one in the middle of July was in of itself unusual. So let's talk about what the police think happened. And they've been open about this. They have publicly stated that they believe Peggy knew her killer and that the killer was familiar with the home.
Whenever we hear something like that in any case file, I don't know which is worse, a random murder or you knew someone. In this case, because Peggy is who she is, like a 61-year-old loving mom, housewife, caregiver for two ailing parents with she is like everyone's friend, it seems. Her daughter calls her every night. This is someone who is well loved seemingly by everyone around her. And to be targeted in this vicious manner, not a stabbing, not a gunshot, but a brutal beating, really chills me to the bone because she just doesn't seem to fit the profile of such a violent, targeted murder.
Exactly. And this is a key point to this case. I mean, this case, there's not a lot of information, not something we could do 2 or 3 episodes on, but there's depth to this case. But you have to really think about it and look at it to see that depth. So the police are saying this is someone she knew. This is someone who was familiar with her and was familiar with the house. Now, this is bolstered by several things. Number 1, Peggy had a habit. If there was a knock on the door, she always checked the front window to see who was there. And she never let anyone in that she didn't know. So, if this wasn't really a break-in, it wasn't really someone who kicked in the door, it wasn't really someone who rushed the house, they would have been someone that Peggy was familiar enough with to let in. And recall, the last data usage on her phone, 1:11 in the morning. Which means one of two things happened here. Either this person came over incredibly late and Peggy nevertheless let them in, or They had been there a while. Remember something else. Her last text message was actually pretty early in the night for somebody who was known to be on the phone all the time. Her last text message goes out at 7:13 p.m. She's sending her last text message. Her last data usage is at 1:11 a.m. That means she didn't make a phone call and she didn't send a text message. She was either doing data on her phone or doing something else, which also makes you wonder if maybe this person had been there a while, which also is going to make you think about possibilities. But let's keep going and we'll come back to some of these possibilities. These are just things to remember.
Yeah, really quick thing on that of someone being there for a while is, what do you typically do if you have company? Maybe put your phone down. You're probably not on your phone nonstop. You're probably not calling someone, texting someone. You're probably giving your attention to the other person because there's nothing else. We've already talked about this at the River House. There's nothing else to do, right? It's a residential dead-end street, and it's nighttime, which means you're probably not floating on the river. You're indoors, hanging out with someone, talking, which may explain why, despite being alone in a house with no other really forms of entertainment, you're not using your phone much.
So then you have the scene. The scene appears to have been staged to look like a break-in, but there is no actual evidence of forced entry. And you have that bizarre thing with the knife, which is just weird. It's just a weird thing to do. I mean, she's got no stab wounds. There's blood on the knife, which means somebody took that knife and basically rubbed it in her blood and then left it sitting there in the kitchen sink for the police to find. It's interesting for a couple reasons. And once again, I want you to think about this. Got to look below, right? It's not just that they did that to stage the scene. What did they not do? Despite the fact this is a vicious attack where she's being kicked to death in the head, where they're dislocating one of her fingers as she's like trying to defend herself.
They don't stab her and end her, right? I mean, it would be, obviously the purpose was to kill her. So if you're going to go through all that trouble of rubbing the knife in her blood while she's, by the way, probably alive, since bleeding to death is kind of a slow thing. Maybe she had lost consciousness. But if your point was to kill her anyway and to make it look like she'd been murdered, then why not just stick the knife in her? That seems like an easier way to get blood on the knife. And it would also make it look more convincing that the stabbing was part of the murder. Or if she were still alive and you wanted to make sure she didn't somehow live, to end her with a knife, right? Like to cut her throat or to do something else that you knew would end her life and that she couldn't possibly live to tell the story.
What it tells me, I think, and this is all speculation because it's all we can do is speculate, but we're speculating on the basis of evidence and thinking about this. And this is a piece of evidence, a knife dipped in blood but not stabbed into her. Now, when did that happen? It happened during the cover-up. It happened during the staging. This attack was brutal and vicious, and you could imagine it might have also been rage-filled. It might have been one of those things where someone did this for some reason, and then once they had done it, realized, oh my God, what did I just do? And when they weren't in the rage, when they were in the cleanup/cover-up mode, maybe they couldn't bring themselves to stab her. That wasn't something they could do when they weren't in a rage. And that may seem strange to you if you're thinking about somebody who just kicked somebody in the face so viciously that they're going to bleed to death. But if you've ever been around someone given to those kinds of rages, and I'm sorry if you have, but you know that when people like that get into a rage, they can do things. And then when it's over, it's like they're a different person and they're deeply apologetic and sorry, and they can turn on a dime like that. And the fact that this person didn't stab her either to end her or to aid in the cover-up tells me that this is a person who, once the rage ended, could not bring themselves to do that. And I think that says something about who you're looking at in this case.
I think it shows some additional level of closeness to her, right? She's not some random person who cares if you stick a knife in them when you're not in this rage-filled mood. And maybe they hadn't done something like this before, right? If you've stabbed multiple people before, maybe you can do it again. We've talked a lot about this, and I'm sorry this is very graphic, but it's not easy to stab someone because your skin, bones, and muscles are actually pretty intact, and there has to be some force used in order to insert a knife into someone. And so you have to have purpose behind it. It is not merely a slip of the hand, in other words. You have to actually want to commit to doing it. And this person couldn't bring themselves to commit to doing it.
And then you have the location itself. You have this house. It's a strange target for random break-in. It is down a gravel single-access road. It is not visible from the street. So if someone was going to break into it, it's not maybe the place that you would think someone would choose as a target. But, it's secluded enough that if you did commit the murder, you have some time to cover it up, and you know that nobody's going to be alone. Another reason to think, and those are some reasons to both think that it wasn't really a burglary, but also to think that someone she knew was involved. The other reason, which is really important, if this was a targeted killing or a killing by someone she knew, it would almost have to be someone she knew, because otherwise they wouldn't know she was there, right? Like a burglar might show up, kick the door in, try and rob the place. But this person who was there would have known that she was going to be there. And there were only a few people who knew that. It wasn't something where, she was there all the time. I mean, you can imagine sort of if you're thinking about possibilities, right? Like, okay, it's a targeted killing. It's someone she knows. It could be someone who's obsessed with her in town. It could be the bartender at the local restaurant who is obsessed with her and follows her home one day and kills her. Well, if it's someone like that, then it's really limited to someone who would have seen her that day and known she was there, or someone she talked to. Those are really the only people it could have been, because otherwise you wouldn't know she was there. You wouldn't expect her to be there. If you were that bartender at the restaurant, unless you saw her there that day, you wouldn't go down to the river house because she doesn't tend to be there alone. The fact that she's there and there alone is an unusual thing unto itself. The fact that she's alone, number one, and the fact that she stayed there an extra night. Those are both things that you would probably only know if you either saw her that day or if you talked to her. And that greatly limits your pool of possible killers.
And remember, the staying there that night was a very last-minute decision. It almost makes me wonder if there is a conversation we don't know. So we know the people who she told she was staying that night, at least her sister and maybe her kids and her husband. But it makes me wonder what had her stay an extra night if her plan was to return to Richmond to be with her sister that day. If she had run into someone while maybe she was in town and they had some unfinished business, maybe it had to do with the estate. Maybe it was like, let's figure this one thing out so you don't have to come back out again. Something along those lines where maybe the decision to stay had to do with this person, where it may have been so innocuous that she didn't mention it to anyone that she spoke with. Because it's such a small pool of people who all seem to love her and also seem to be geographically in places that are impossible to be close enough to commit this, that it seems like there must have been another conversation at some point. And I don't think we know why she ultimately decided to stay that night. It's not public, and I don't know if her loved ones know or if it was brought up. Obviously, if that's part of the investigative file, there could be reasons for holding that back. But exactly what you said, Brett, with such a small pool of unlikely suspects, really, I feel like someone happened to know she was there that night. And look at the rest of her life. She's always with someone, right? She's always there with her family. She was there with her family just earlier that week. She's usually with her sister, who has young children. She is really rarely alone in general, which again points this, for me, more to a rage-filled killing rather than a sniper attack knowing she's alone that night.
And then there's the cell phone. And I think the cell phone is a very interesting piece of evidence. Her cell phone has never been recovered. And the police believe that the killer knew enough about cell phones and how it can be used to track somebody that they powered down the device soon after the murder and they never turned it back on. It is the only thing of value that was taken other than a 19-inch small TV. And that's despite the fact the place was ransacked. There's no jewelry, no money taken. Ask yourself, if you were the killer, why would you take the risk of stealing the cell phone, which you can turn it off, but you just never know what tools the police may have to track that cell phone. Why would you take that risk? Or to be found with her cell phone, even, if you're pulled over on the way out or something. Why would you take that risk? Is it really so you can sell it at a pawn shop for however much you would get for a pawned cell phone, which, by the way, has never turned up again? You would think the pawn shop owner would have turned the cell phone on at some point and the police would have located it. Why do you do that? The only reason that I can imagine that you would do that is to destroy evidence. What's some evidence you might be trying to destroy? One of the issues with true crime, and when you're talking about the victim of a murder, is there are times where you almost feel like you're re-victimizing them when you speculate about what happened. Because inevitably, you start to speculate about what was going on in their life at the time. But you have to do that, and it's victimology. You're trying to figure out what could be the potential things that led to their death. Remember, the last text message she sent was at 7:13. Now, we speculated it's possible somebody was there with her for the next 6 hours or whatever. But what's another possibility? Another possibility was she was communicating with someone over something that did not involve text. That would be data-based, whether it could be Snapchat, Signal, encrypted types of communications that erase, types of communications that would be stored on the cell phone itself. And that if you wanted to access, you would need the cell phone itself. And if you were the person she was communicating with, and you knew she communicated with you on Snapchat or on Signal, then you might think, I need to get the cell phone so the police don't know that one of the last people she talked to, for whatever reason, was me. The only reason I can imagine taking that cell phone away from that house when you didn't take anything else of value is because you knew there was evidence that you had been there on the cell phone.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The thing with data usage is we can subpoena a lot of places, but if you're not calling or texting and you're using all these different types of encrypted apps, and we don't know what you're using, by the way, like we don't know to check WhatsApp, we don't know to check Instagram stories. There's just so many ways of communicating now that there could be something that lives on the phone. My other thought was that maybe there were voice memos. Maybe, voice memos live on your phone. Unless you send them to someone, they're not going to be transported. Even if you text a voice memo, that's not going to be captured necessarily on a phone record. If you subpoena them, you might get the fact that a text was sent, but the substance of the voice memo, for example, is gone because those typically auto erase, or a photo that was taken or a video that was taken that is on the phone but hasn't been transmitted through any means, through the internet, through email, and doesn't reside anywhere else but on the phone. And it makes me wonder whether that had been on her phone for either some time or that something had happened around the 1/11 time period that sent this other person, her killer, into a rage. I don't know what that is, especially when she often communicated with her loved ones. And I usually use the same means of communication. Like I usually, use the same ways of talking. I use WhatsApp with all the mom boards and whatnot, like for my kids' schools and whatnot. But I don't usually have many, many different types of apps. So this might be information the police have, but think about, if you knew her, of different ways she communicated, and think of not just the typical ways, not just people who want to encrypt their talking, right? This is not just, now we all do encrypted messaging. It's not just for people who are trying to do something illicit anymore. We all do it because we're worried about advertisers buying our data, which is absolutely happening, that sort of thing, and being, targeted for ads. That's why a lot of us use VPNs and encryption. And so it's become so common that we actually find this to be a little bit difficult in finding all the ways of communication within a cell phone. And here's the thing, they knew exactly to never turn it on, so they didn't need to access it. It wasn't like they needed the picture or the video or the voice memo off of it. They just needed to make sure it was never discovered.
I think it's pretty evident that they took that cell phone and destroyed it. They got rid of it. And that was the reason for taking it. And whether it's a photo or a video or a conversation on something like Signal or WhatsApp or Snapchat or whatever, that was the reason they did it. And this raises all sorts of possibilities about who this would be. I think whenever you see a case like this, you always think about the husband. I mean, that's always the first person that you think of. And to my knowledge, the husband has never been considered a suspect in this case, beyond just the obvious if you're always a suspect if you're a husband. And the thing is, I obviously don't know all the details of his itinerary, but it seems pretty clear that he was gone by then. He had gone back to Cleveland. He had left with AJ. Now, he would have known that she was there. So maybe you're thinking, aha, it's a hitman. The hitman's not going to kick somebody in the head and then leave. I mean, you don't know she's going to die from that. Like, he would have stabbed her. If it was somebody who was paid to kill someone, he's going to make sure they're dead.
And the hitman would have been unknown to her. But it appears that she let in the person, whether it was that she let them stay until past midnight or she let someone in at 1 a.m. You know, that this is not going to be some random person. You're definitely going to hire a random hitman. You're not going to hire your neighbor who she knows.
And it's almost never a hitman. I mean, that's the other thing.
This is true.
Usually if it's a hitman, it's going to be something cartel related or something like that. It's not going to be a random hitman. It's going to be a member of the cartel who's sort of sent to do it. Obviously, I think it's pretty clear Peggy wasn't involved with the cartel. Neither was her husband. This is probably not her husband hiring a hitman. I don't think that's what it is. Now, it could be, but I think that's unlikely. And then you start to think, okay, well, if it's not her husband and the police think it's someone she knows, and it was this vicious attack, it could have been a friend. It could have been another family member, but you have to remember, and I don't want to speculate too much because this lady was brutally murdered, and the way the internet is and everything else, people take things and run with it. But she'd been in Richmond for a while. She had been there by herself, taking care of her ailing father for a long time. I am sure she met people. Maybe she even met somebody who became really close to her, maybe a male. And you don't have to assume that she was having an affair with this person. She could have just become close with them, and maybe they wanted to have some sort of relationship with her. She's going to stay there. Maybe she says, hey, I'm staying for an extra night. Why don't you come over? We'll have some wine and watch television or whatever, right? And he comes over and he's expecting this is when their relationship's going to go to the next level. And she rebuffs him, and that leads to this violent attack that ends up in her death. He realizes what he's done. He tries to cover it up, but he can't bring himself to stab her. So he does what he does, and then he flees. What's interesting about this, they have DNA in this case, and they think it's relevant, and they know who it belongs to. What is interesting about that, if you have DNA at a murder scene that you think is relevant, the only way that wouldn't lead you to be able to take some pretty serious investigative steps up to and including arresting the person, but certainly executing some search warrants and some other things that I think would probably lead to us knowing who that is if there was a reason for their DNA to be there. And this goes back to the somebody she knew, somebody she was close with, somebody who'd been there before. So the police have this DNA. It's really suspicious. It makes you think this person is involved. It makes that person their prime suspect. But because there are other ways the DNA could have gotten there, it's not enough for the police to make a move. And the police are still waiting for that last piece of information that ties that person to the murder. I think this is a case where the police probably know who did it, or they have a really good idea of who did it, but they don't have probable cause for search warrants, and they don't have probable cause for an arrest, and they don't think they can get to beyond a reasonable doubt if they do arrest the person. And so they're stuck in this situation where they really can't move forward until they have one more piece of information. In 2020, as I said, the FBI released that video which takes you on a tour of the crime scene, and they are looking for help from the public. They have sought any information pertaining to Lammers' death, people she was known to communicate with, or activity occurring near the resident. And if you have that information, please contact the FBI's Richmond Field Office at 804-261-1044.
And Brett, one other thing I wanted to note, because we've been talking about her dealing with her parents' estate and the fact that her parents had done well for themselves, and she, recently lost both her parents, meaning she was going to receive a sizable inheritance. I personally think this is a little bit of a red herring. I think it's important to discuss because obviously money makes people do crazy things. We recently covered a case where parents who left a house to 3 siblings ended in a terrible murder likely committed by one of those siblings because they were trying to divide the house among all 3 of them. The thing here, though, to remember is that maybe there was a will in place that changed the typical inheritance structure, but it wouldn't necessarily make sense for the other inheritors, in other words, siblings, to go after her inheritance by murdering her because she has grown children. And so typically how that flows is that even if the child of the parents who have passed away have an inheritance, and let's say it's Peggy, even if she were to pass away before she gets the inheritance, typically, unless there is some will that alters the kind of natural state of affairs, it would flow to her children. And so there's like kind of a path that money would flow anyway. And so I note that because everyone's going to be thinking about money and inheritance, and it might have something to do with this. I mean, she was certainly there because she was trying to deal with estates. And even if it wasn't to get her inheritance, by being the person who was dealing with the estate, she had a lot of power in making sure that, you know, all the T's were crossed, I's dotted, that whole thing. And so even if it wasn't about her own inheritance, it may have had something to do with how she was distributing the estate in the way that was consistent with her parents' will.
I think another reason I think it has nothing really to do with the inheritance is the river house remains unoccupied to this day. Basically, the family's never done anything with it. They haven't really even changed anything. If you watch some of the videos from the 7-year anniversary where local news go in, there's still a puzzle sitting unfinished on the dining room table that Peggy had been working on at the time she died. So, you know, the idea that she had to be taken out so they could sell that property right on the water and get the money for it, it just doesn't really ring true. I think this was a crime that was motivated by some intense feelings. And I think that's where it came from. Now, look, you know, money can drive intense feelings. As we've said, nothing separates family members more than an inheritance. So that is a possibility. And I don't think, and it's unfortunate. I mean, you hate these situations because you've got a family that was so close and they've suffered this horrible loss, but you can't help but look at them with some suspicion. When you have an unsolved crime like this, when the police are telling you it was someone she knew, you know, just, you can imagine what it's like for them. You know, her kids are looking at their father, or looking at their aunt, or looking at their uncle, or whatever, and wondering, like, could you have had something to do with my mom's death? And that's just a horrible place to be. And the only way that suspicion will ever be entirely put to rest is if we're able to solve this crime. And the only way we're going to do that is if somebody comes forward with some information. So if you have that information, reach out to the FBI or reach out to us. Feel free to email us, prosecutorspod@gmail.com. We're always happy to take your tips. We're always happy to turn that information over to the appropriate authorities if for some reason you feel more comfortable talking to us than talking to them. Well, Alice, do you have anything else to say about this case before we move on?
No, except that it's just, it truly is devastating because of the brutalness of this and the way it's affected this small town. I mean, we know people who have been affected because they're in the community. This is devastating because I think we are one fact away from being able to bring justice to Peggy and her loved ones. So if you know anything, please report it, whether you think it has anything to do with her murder or not.
And like I said, if you want to contact us, prosecutorspod@gmail.com. You get our website, Prosecutors Podcast. Feel free to hit us up on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever, @ProsecutorsPod. We're always happy to hear from you. I'm glad so many people could join us tonight for this recording from our Patreon. They're hearing this like a month early because they're hearing it early. Not only early and ad-free, but live. But even if they're not here live, they'll hear it early and ad-free. So I hope you'll join Patreon if you're interested in that. And if you go to Apple and leave a 5-star review, you can include a question, which we will answer on a podcast, one just like we've had tonight. Alice, are you up for answering a question?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay, let's see if there's one that's not. You guys have gotten to where y'all ask very
These are tense
serious
questions.
I know. Okay, this is a good one. This is a good one. Okay. This is from Miss Pronomore. Gotta ask, what is your favorite donut type and why?
Oh, I like that question.
Yeah. So the answer for me is pretty easy. I love the Krispy Kreme chocolate frosted donuts. I mean, they're just.
Is that where the
good.
chocolate glaze is on top? Is that right?
Yes, exactly. It's a chocolate glazed frosted donut. So it's a glazed donut
Double glaze.
with like chocolate poured on top of it. And it's just, I mean, Just thinking about it makes me happy. Those are my favorite. I mean, I like Boston cream and stuff like that, but just a chocolate glazed chocolate frosted glazed donut is amazing. So that's going to be my favorite.
So this shows you why we have our favorite donut places, yours being Krispy Kreme and mine being Dunkin', because I love the cakey chocolate donut that just has the like white glaze. It's not even a glaze. It's really just sugar, but it tastes like a cake or a brownie. That chocolate donut is my favorite. I don't love like cream fillings or sprinkles on top. It's just really simple. Chocolate all around. And the cakier the better. Really, I think I just like brownies. That's probably the answer.
Yeah, I mean that is a fundamental difference. If you like the sort of more dense
Cakey,
cake-like,
yes, or fluffy.
Yeah,
they're both straight sugar to the veins and fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
But they are,
Wonderful.
but they're totally different. It's almost like they're not donuts. They're two different things.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Okay, one more, another pretty straightforward one, which I don't know if we talked about this one or not, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts if we haven't talked about it. This is from CF15403. She would like to know, what is your favorite song on the new Taylor Swift album, The Tortured Poets, whatever, Society, or whatever it is?
I like how you just say
Department.
whatever.
Department. It's the Dead Poets Society and the
It is the
Tortured
Dead
Poets Department. Yeah. What do you think? Do you have a favorite?
Do you have a favorite? Also, while we're recording tonight, she had to cancel her Austria concerts because of the terrorist attacks. That's goodness.
Insane. Yeah. The world we live in. So here's what I'll say about that album. That album is interesting because I really think it is an album for people who like albums. It's much more, to me, there weren't
It's a cohesive album.
Exactly. There's not like, this is a great standout, gonna be a super massive hit song on the album to me in the way there are on a lot of her other albums. It was more like, it is very cohesive. So I think it's hard to pick out a single song. Now, the kids love Florida, and I love Florence and the Machine. So we listen to Florida a lot. And that's probably one of my favorites.
I really like I Can Do It With a Broken Heart, because it's one of the only boppers on it, but it's obviously really dark. And I feel like if you are trying to work full time, parent small children, do a podcast at night, you just like sometimes slap a smile on and you're like, I can do it. I can do it. And it makes me feel seen. Right.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I enjoyed the album. It's not my favorite of hers. It is very dark. It's almost too dark for me.
The only problem for me, and I've said this before, it's not that I don't love it. It's that I can play her other albums because there are fewer explicit words around my kids. So I can't listen to this album very much because my kids are always around. And they're just way too many explicit, very loud,
She's
F
gotten
words.
more and more explicit as
She has. And that's totally fine. The problem is just I can't listen to it as much because normally I can like sneak it in while I'm cooking dinner, but now I can't do that because my kids are like, will scream it from the top of their lungs. So that's the only problem for me is I can't listen to it as much as I'd like.
Yeah. We could listen to Olivia Rodrigo's driver's license song until the kids could really start to talk, and then we had to stop. One of the best uses of the F word in a song in that one, by the way. I mean, 1989, I think, is my favorite album of hers. It's just...
It depends on my mood.
Great. I love
it.
Well, there's a song for
week,
every mood in it.
That's the thing. Like 1989, if I am at the beach or a river with my friends, it feels great. But like earlier this week, all three of my kids were projectile vomiting, and I was like catching vomit midair, and I was like, I'm gonna put on Reputation in my earbuds because I feel like this is the only way to get through the day.
Yeah, I mean, Lana Del Rey is still my first love, but I do love Taylor Swift's great. She's great.
No, Amanda. Clean versions just don't do it for me. It doesn't hit the same way.
It's not the same.
It doesn't hit the same way. I appreciate that there are clean versions, but I like the original.
Yeah. Okay. Well, those are your answers to your questions tonight. Like I said, if you have some really good questions you want to ask or questions that aren't that good, feel free to drop us a 5-star review on Apple, and we will get to it. Eventually, we have tons to answer, so we're going to work our way through them. All right, guys, we will be back with another new case next week. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
We are the Prosecutors.
It's like kind of sad.
This whole like getting older thing.
Getting older because it just means we are closer
We're
to death,
definitely
man.
getting older.
We're like closer to death.
Every day, closer to death. I'm gonna go ahead and go live.
Yeah,
if that's
yeah.
okay.
Everyone needs to hear this.
Hello,
Share
everyone.
my sadness with everyone.
Okay, share yourself.
I'm just sitting here in the closet.
You do what you want to do.
Deciding what Halloween costumes we're gonna wear.
Oh, nice.
Should Brittany be a skunk?
Little stinker.
Exactly. I think that's a thing. But it's like 100 degrees where we are, and I feel it. You know how like it builds on each other? So this is like day, I don't know, 100 of 100 degrees. I'm so hot.
Yeah, this is August in Alabama. It's always.
I know. I just carry, and I usually
brutally
don't
hot.
like carry around buckets of ice. I literally just hold ice in my hands. Like I'm not drinking from it. I'm just holding it.